first national festival of humanities in the UK. And the festival is led by the School of Advanced Study, which is part of the University of London, and that's in partnership with the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the British Academy. All of the events taking place in Senate House today have been coordinated by the School of Advanced Study and explore what it means to be human in the digital age. And that's going to be the focus of the discussion this afternoon. Don't forget that there are events taking place throughout the whole of next week, countrywide, so there'll probably be something new to where you are, so do encourage you to go along. And there are other digital sessions too. And you can follow the festival on @BeingHumanFest, and the hashtag, if you want to tweet from this session today, is #BeingHuman14. And I've been asked to remind everybody not to forget to fill out the feedback forms, which I know is very tedious, but it helps us to make this a better event in the future, because this is the first time we've run it. So great, thank you very much.
So welcome and thanks everyone for coming. It's great to see so many people out in support of the humanities, and thanks also to the organisers for putting this great event on. My name is Ben Doyle and I'm Commissioning Editor for Literature at Palgrave Macmillan. As part of Macmillan, Palgrave has been publishing academic research in the social sciences, humanities and business areas for over 170 years now. We publish monographs, reference works and also business books. We publish researchers who have just finished their PhD and are starting their careers right through to some of the biggest names in the field. Our headquarters are in King's Cross, just around the corner, but we also have people all over the world, so editors in Shanghai and New York. In the past few years, as the global downturn hit and funds for research became increasingly scarce, many said that the humanities would suffer first. It's true that the academic community sometimes finds it harder to make the case for the humanities, but that doesn't mean that these disciplines don't have a very positive impact or a vibrant future, and we're currently publishing a great deal of scholarship that would attest to that. We believe that the future of the humanities is bright, particularly because of forward-looking disciplines such as the digital humanities, which sit at the intersection of computing and the disciplines of the humanities. Today you'll hear from 3 experts in their fields in 3 different formats. A short, snappy Pecha Kucha presentation from Dr. Matt Hayler, a talk from Professor Willard McCarty, and finally a video contribution from Paul Arthur. Paul's in Australia, so unfortunately he won't be around to take questions afterwards, as it would be 1 in the morning for him. Also, I should say thanks to Andrew Linnick for helping with the video for that. By way of a little more introduction for our esteemed panel, Matt Hayler is a lecturer in post-1945 literature at the University of Birmingham. His research focuses on the use of digital technology, particularly e-reading, and the embodiment of both user and artifact. His first book, Challenging the Phenomena of Technology, is coming out with Palgrave next year. Willard McCarty is Professor of Humanities Computing at King's College London and Professor Research Group in Digital Humanities at the School of Humanities and Communication Arts, University of Western Sydney, as well as Fellow of the Royal Anthropological Institute in London. He's editor of the journal Interdisciplinary Science Reviews and founding editor of the online seminar Humanities. He's received awards from the Consortium for Computers in the Humanities, the Richard W. Lyman Award from the US National Humanities Center and the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Roberto Busa Prize from the Association for Digital Humanities Organizations. He's editor of Text and Genre in Reconstruction, author of the first comprehensive theoretical treatment of his field, humanities computing, which we actually reissued in paperback earlier this year, and is currently writing a historical study of the relation between computing and the humanities. Dr. Jane Winters is Reader in Digital Humanities at the Institute of Historical Research. Jane's involved with 3 big data projects at the moment on web archives and parliamentary history. And I should also say a big thanks to Jane for stepping in at the last moment to chair the panel. Paul Arthur is Professor and Inaugural Chair in Digital Humanities at the University of Western Sydney. He was previously Deputy Director of the ANU Centre for European Studies, a joint-funded special initiative of the European Commission and the Australian National University. A Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, he's published widely in fields of cultural studies, communication, history, literature and media, and has held visiting appointments in Europe, North America and Australasia. Paul's inaugural President of the Australasian Association for Digital Humanities and serves on the steering committee of the Global Alliance of Digital Humanities Organisations. He published his most recent book with us, titled Advancing Digital Humanities, Research, Methods, Theories. So now I will hand over to Matt to kick things off.
Hi. So essentially, I just want to talk a little bit about what it is I do, and I suspect that because it's quite different to what Willard and Paul do, it will hopefully give us something to talk about in a few minutes. Essentially, I always wonder whether I'm allowed to say that I'm a digital humanist, whether I do digital humanities, and perhaps we can decide if this is something that I'm actually allowed to say. Because I come at this stuff by thinking and writing about technology and involvement. For the last 3 years, I've been a teaching fellow at the University of Exeter, but this year I've started as a lecturer in post-1945 literature at the University of Birmingham. And you can tell that I'm enjoying it there because that is a ridiculously flattering picture of the campus. At the moment it is all slate grey skies and horizontal rain, but like any good southerner, I'm convinced that the Midlands are secretly the wilds of the north. But I specialise in teaching contemporary literature. 20th and 21st century works. This slide that's about to come up, I'm already running. Petricuch is a weird format for writing. There we go. This slide is for a friend in the audience who I suspect actually thinks that this is what I teach most of the time. But my interest in the contemporary probably starts to get me towards concerns that might be recognisable as digital humanities, because I tend to focus on works that reflect current events, current politics, current issues. And these tend, in one way or another, to connect to, or eventually to connect to, some aspect of digital culture. So I particularly specialise in experimental works. The texts that I've explored in my research tend to be formally experimental in some way. Works that play with the bodies of books and the arrangements of the words on the page. Here, for instance, we have Jonathan Safran Foer's novel Tree of Codes, produced by Foer taking his favourite book, Bruno Schulz's The Street of Crocodiles, and then erasing letters and words to make a whole new work. The publishing company Visual Editions then found printers who were able to individually die-cut each page to perform the erasings that Foer went through to produce this new work. And this is an example of the kind of embodiment that I'm interested in, where the body of the technology and the body of the user meet, and one forces the other to do something new. My published research so far is focused on e-reading and the move from page to screen, and I'm particularly interested in what changes when a work that was originally in print becomes something to be read on an iPad or a Kindle. Is this the same book? And if not, why is it not? This has led me to explore why readers tend to so vehemently dislike reading on screen, to claim that it is unnatural or that it doesn't feel right, or why it's so important that a Kindle doesn't smell as good as an old book. My research so far has really emphasised practice, what it is that users do, what printed books and digital books do, and to what extent that practice is fixed, to what extent acting in particular ways is important or even essential. And I gave a TED talk on these ideas, talked about digital technology's potential to be beautiful, to be as beautiful as book reading. I think that we often assume that plastic and glass can never have the same sensuous pleasures as paper pages, that digital tools will always be somehow soulless. And so I told some stories about how I've seen young people who've grown up using these devices, use them as an extension of being a teenager. Girls do their makeup in iPads with front-facing camera turned on to make them into mirrors, laptops covered in stickers, mobile phones that are nail varnished and covered with dangling totems, online profiles and blogs lovingly created and curated. My argument was that as long as things can become boring, can become everyday, then they can form the strangely beautiful heart of expert practice, just like books. And yet I grew up with print, and I love paper books. It's more than a little bit exciting for me that my first book, as was mentioned, is coming out next year with Palgrave. And it seems, if I'm doing a plug, if I could just ask everyone to place their Amazon orders as soon as the session is done, that would be great. The first chapter is all about technology in the popular imagination, how we conceive of it, how we think about it, how it always seems to be something new and faintly scary. Those things that we're most used to never seem like technologies anymore. In particular, this chapter looks at why we might consider technology to be unnatural when it's so much a part of being human. The second chapter tries to address some of this by looking at the history of how we define technology. It looks at the common sense definition that many people accept, that technology is a human thing that allows us to exceed the basic capabilities of our bodies, and then challenges this as too simple. Technology is about more than the tools that allow us to do new things. So I try and outline what I think is a more accurate definition. That technology is about a particular kind of experience, of using an artifact, of using a tool that extends our abilities, exists in a community of users, can be incorporated into our sense of self so that we don't have to focus on using it, and also that it domesticates a user over time. The third chapter focuses on amateur and expert use, and the ways in which the same tool can appear to be a very different object to different users. To the apprentice, the teeth of the saw get stuck in the wood, there's a lot of sweating, it takes a lot of effort to do the work. This is a world away from the master carpenter whose easy push and draw of the blade professes their expertise. The effect is the same, the wood gets cut in half, but the experiences are totally different. And the same can be said of the Kindle or the iPad. To some users, they seem wholly insurmountable, but to others, they're just a natural way to read and interact with data. The same object, but not quite the same. Chapter 4 sees technology as an embodiment of knowledge. This is probably the hardest thing to explain over a 30-second slide. But essentially, this chapter is interested in what that word knowledge means and argues that our tools start to know something about their users. For anyone that's interested, this is placed in contrast to Don Eder and Peter Paul Verbeek's post-phenomenology and Graham Harman's object-oriented ontology. The final chapter is perhaps easier to explain this idea. This last chapter argues that technologies can be seen as having evolved, that they are under continuous selective pressures between generations of tools. And if this is the case, then we can apply a branch of philosophy which unites knowledge and evolution, evolutionary epistemology. We might argue that a stick insect's body has a greater knowledge of its environment than the stick insect could ever mentally possess. The stick insect doesn't know anything about looking like a stick, but its body does. In the same way, technologies seem to possess an inherited knowledge about their own environment of use. Anyway, I came up with a digital and cyberculture studies course at Exeter that united my teaching and my research interests. I taught it for 2 years, and it was really the first class where I asked, what are the digital humanities? I'm not sure that we ever came to a satisfactory conclusion, or rather we all came to different conclusions that, to my mind at least, all need to be present in a field that we might call the digital humanities. We talked about sex online and subcultures. We talked about online politics and new kinds of activism. We talked about social media and privacy and how you come up with new laws for an always connected, frequently online world. We got excited about video games and new kinds of written text that might incorporate sound and movies and new kinds of navigation. In general, we asked, what does digitization do? And as part of that course, the students had to build things and then write the essays about what they had built. Because the idea of less yak, more hack, stop theorizing and start creating, is at the heart of a significant thread of digital humanities work. So they made video games and hypertexts. They made databases of 5 centuries of hyperlinked love letters. They made gay and straight online dating profiles and talked about the experience of coming out online. And a couple of them even wired their house for sound and video, lived for 5 days under a state of surveillance to write about their experience. With my first book finished and my current project ending at Christmas, in the new year I start new research. And I'm building on my discussions of tool use and expertise in digital culture by exploring transhumanism, specifically the modification of the body through technology. I want to look at how we can and will be able to modify ourselves, why people are already doing it, where that motivation comes from. But I'm also interested in the artistic representations of modification in fiction, and how films and books and comics and video games impact on the ethics and expectations of how we alter ourselves. And I think that transhumanism, if I can slip into academic jargon for a second, can be usefully positioned at the nexus of the cognitive, medical, and digital humanities. Each of these fields brings something to understanding the impact and importance and interrelation of modern technology, the human body, and our cognition. TDCS gives us a neat example of this. TDCS stands for transcranial direct current stimulation, and it's a method at the heart of a practical area of neuroscience exploring the effects of low voltages being passed through areas of the brain. It has the potential to treat depression, speed up and improve the accuracy of our movements, improve our memories. But there are also some truly terrifying YouTube videos of people electrocuting themselves in their own home. And this is where the nexus of fields comes in. Because TDCS is as much an amateur movement as a professional scientific movement. It reminds me of the Victorian self-experimenters. And these amateur communities record their results and email them to scientists who would never get the ethical clearance to do the same test. And they buy their parts on eBay, and they download illegally accessed PDFs of the latest research. And they're actually getting somewhere. And really, the only way to understand all of this is the meeting points of the history of cognitive science, the history of medicine, and of digital culture. Not just science, but the human dimension, the practice. So I don't know if what I do is digital humanities, or digital studies, or cyberculture studies, but I'm proud to be keeping these particular threads alive within an English department. Being the person who can go off and learn about all of this stuff and then bring it back to the text of our time and ask new questions of my students. And I think that a bit of that, at least, is worth including in the field of digital humanities.
Are we taking questions at the end or after the presentation? At the end. So I think it's over to you. And
Right. Right. The book I'm working on has the working title of Machines of Demanding Grace. There are few of you perhaps in the audience old enough to have been alert when Richard Brautigan, a Californian poet, wrote the poem Machines of Loving Grace. Brautigan committed suicide, perhaps related to his idea that machines love us. I'm not sure, but it certainly seems to me that they demand this particular machine or scheme for the invention of indefinitely many machines makes great demands of us. The particular demand that I'm interested in is the question mark that it places over its relationship to the humanities. Historically, we have construed that relationship as primarily one of service. That is, the digital machine and the software on it that comes from computer science and from various industries serves the humanities by dishing out more of the same, by allowing us to get to more things more quickly. And that certainly has effects. But it's not a very interesting relationship. It doesn't say anything about what the humanities does to computing, and it doesn't see beyond service. So I started out wondering about this some time ago with the question of why it has taken so very long, and that means about nearly 70 years, about 65, 67 years, for us to get around asking some of the questions we're asking now. Why is it that WWII has had to ask, where is the cultural criticism in digital humanities? Why have we been so slow to come up with criticism of our own that is at that intersection of computing and humanities? And it seemed to me that the way to answer this question was historically, by looking at the literature of the field from its beginnings in basically the very early 60s to some convenient point. And the convenient point is, I think, the end of the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Empire and the release of the World Wide Web, which are almost simultaneous. The web has made a big difference, so I blocked off this period and looked at the literature of the period and found a recurrent theme, a recurrent kind of public hand-wringing in which practitioners in the field, a very small number of people scattered around the world, were noticing every once in a while that they weren't getting anywhere, that no one was paying attention to them, that literary criticism and various other kinds of academic enterprises were going on their way quite merrily without paying any attention at all. So I wondered, well, why is this? Why is this? And I discovered a number of attempts to answer this question, which involved a certain amount of finger pointing, blaming Noam Chomsky, blaming French critical theory, blaming whatever. But that didn't seem to me to be a very good answer. So I enlarged my scope of vision to the environment in which these people were working. I thought these scholars, these few scholars, were ordinary people like you and me, who went to the shop, shopped for groceries, read newspapers, had children, bought toys for them, talked to their neighbors, and so on. So what was going on in the ambient environment from, let's say, 1962 to 1989 or so? What was happening was the Cold War. And so I studied the Cold War and what a frightening world that was for all of us then. It takes a certain amount of reading to get back into the mindset of children such as I was, who were trained to dive under their desks to protect themselves against the atomic blast. As silly as that sounds, people in North America and in the UK were trained to do this. Booklets were issued for the populace. All sorts of movies were produced and so on about what might happen in the next second. In other words, I got fascinated by the image of technoscience that was being presented. And I've then found in the literature of digital humanities various expressions of this fear of computing from, it's going to deprive us of our jobs, which was common throughout the working population, to, what role are we going to have as scholars once the computer starts doing all the marvelous things that these people are telling us. I wondered why there were, in the midst of all of this fascinating activity that was going on in the sciences, why the people in the humanities were paying no attention. I came up with no good answers, so then I enlarged my scope of vision once again, historically, and discovering a couple of essays by Sigmund Freud in 1917, in which he remarked on, you probably know this from its various echoes, the three great blows to human self-worth. Copernicus, Darwin, and of course Freud himself as the third, perhaps, greatest blow to the narcissistic attitude we have about ourselves as a species. But then I thought more about this, and it seemed to me that I had to enlarge my historical scope even further to include the what turns out to be really the moral program of science, which begins, I suppose conveniently can be said to begin with Francis Bacon, whose career was in large measure an attempt to fight against what he called, in one of his works, the sciences as one would. In other words, our capacity to delude ourselves, to find wherever we look what we want to find. And you can then trace this moral program of the sciences, which Galileo shared, at least according to A.C. Crombie, all the way through from starting at a convenient point like Francis Bacon in the Renaissance down to the present day. The view of sciences about what their moral duty is, what justifies the doing of the sciences as apart from just inventing useful things for us. And this then gets to the question of the human, because with all of these technological advancements, which are going on at ever greater speed, with machines becoming more and more capable of being like us, with movies pouring out of various countries, including the United States, Sweden, Spain, and so on, envisioning either a near future or a parallel world in which we live with robots, and brushing us abrasively up against the speculations of what it would be like to live with these creatures, and with the assurance that we get from some people in the artificial intelligentsia that this is only a matter of time. And I think in large measure it is only a matter of time. This raises the terribly disturbing question of what do we mean by being human? So I've been working on that for some time. That's one half of the story that I'm trying to tell in this book. The other half begins with the phenomenon, with the idea of what sort of computing do we want to have? What sort of computing would suit us as scholars, as people who are interested in the arts and literature and so on, and music? What kind of computing would we like to have? If we're going to be sitting across the table from a robot looking very much like a human, what would we like this creature to look like? That's one way of asking the question. And so I looked back at the history of computing and discovered the phenomenon of simulation, which began almost at the very beginning of computing, in the imagination of John von Neumann and others who were busy building first the atomic bomb and then the hydrogen bomb. Using computational techniques to reach beyond what humans could possibly study, which was certainly the case with the hydrogen bomb. And then following simulation and what its effects have been, first on the sciences and the social sciences, and then speculating about what its effects could be on the humanities. The fact that, for example, in climatological science, the attempt to model the climate of the whole world, as Paul Edwards describes it, started out with local collection of local data, but as the network to collect this data grew, the problem became collecting enough consistent data from all the parts of the world accurately to model the climate. And what happened was, as largely what happened with the hydrogen bomb simulations that were used to design the weapon, was that the data started being massaged in order to fit the model. In other words, what ended up being studied was part the world and part the model. So this blurring of the whole idea of what is real, what is your subject of study, seems to be the effect of simulation everywhere it has gone. This means that the humanities are dealing with a very different conception of the sciences than has been ours for a long time. And the question I'm wrestling with now is, what do we do with this relationship with the sciences that has changed as a result of simulation? And what sort of simulation, what could this mean for us in the disciplines? I'm sorry if this sounds a bit incoherent, but the book isn't done yet. And I hope when it is, there will be a persuasive argument, or at least it'll be focused enough to raise some interesting debates. For the purpose of the academic life is conversation. So I hope we have more of here. Thank you.
It's great to be reminded that this sort of research is not new. Humanities computing has a long tradition, and a lot of that informs the direction we're going now. So it's great to have that reminder that we're not doing something completely new. And finally, we're going to have a video.
I think there's probably about 5 or 6 key areas of interest that I have in digital history, and in particular in how these digital tools and methods are adding to the way that we understand the past now. One is that whereas scholarship used to be in the hands of experts, nowadays the public is encouraged to contribute their own material and their own views. And this is not just enabled by the technology, it's part of a much longer process over the past couple of decades or more of what's sometimes referred to as the democratization of history, where no longer do we tell only the dominant stories of the past, the major kind of narratives of history and nation, which were very politically biased and had a particular political agenda. Nowadays we want to tell the story of individual experiences or of competing viewpoints, and that means that everyday people, everyone who is a citizen in our society, should have the right and the capacity to be able to contribute to the historical record from their perspective. But where does that leave the expert? Where does that leave the historian or the cultural critic or the literary critic, who may once have been perhaps the sole reference point for this body of knowledge? And this is something that digital tools and methods are working with now. Crowdsourcing is a term that describes the ability for everyday people to contribute information to historical projects, to cultural projects, to social projects, and to have their viewpoint heard or accommodated. And it takes many form available around the world to multiple audiences. There are whole communities of interest that are studying the history of a particular location or region, but they may not be based there. The history of Central Europe may be studied from all around the world, and indeed that mirrors the expansion, the distribution of people from one part of the world to another. A key area that's often talked about is big data and data analytics. We talk about history now being full of the abundance of information about the past. How can we discriminate between what is helpful historical information and what is perhaps just ephemeral or not particularly useful for understanding the past? This is a big area for computer science, and it's showing a new connection between computer science and the study of history. But it's also a major issue for collecting institutions and for libraries and archives. What do you collect? What is valuable now? It used to be that we had policies for collecting everything, all publications. Now the policies are all about how do we forget, how do we keep what's important and have selective processes, because every day so much information is generated that it would take a lifetime to sort through. How do we collect in new ways? And I think perhaps finally a key point is all this data is being collected about individual lives and also being collected by institutions about important periods and aspects and events in history. How do we make sure that all this collection of data is part of one kind of framework that can be accessed by a user? How can a researcher have confidence that they're able to access all the information that's been collected? And part of the future of digital tools and technologies is the semantic web. It's Web 3, as it's sometimes called. It's an internet and a World Wide Web in which there are automated connections between data sources, where if I search for one person who was significant in Ukrainian history, I may be able to find them in any number.
I'm really sorry, guys. It seems like that is an inopportune moment. I think we'll have to go to the discussion
I
section.
think there was probably enough there that we could pick up a discussion afterwards. So, well, that's three really fantastically thought-provoking talks, and I hope that you've got lots of questions that you're going to want to ask. I wanted to start with a couple of things, and then we'll pass it over to you to ask questions. First, Matt, it was great to hear you talking about the materiality of technical objects, because one of the criticisms that's levelled against digital research is that it loses materiality. So the newspapers on the screen, you lose the context of where an article appeared, you don't know what it felt like, how people would have used that in history. And I just wanted to talk a little bit more about how we try and capture some of those elements a bit better than I think we have been doing.
In terms of archival research?
Yeah, and just an understanding of materiality when we're doing research in a digital space.
Yeah. I'm always reminded of a story that a scholar from the States called Willard. She was researching in a library, and she had the opportunity to go out to this library for the first time to see texts that she'd only ever seen as digital models. And they were fantastic digital models, really beautiful 3D, high-quality laser scan things. She'd been able to search, she'd been able to identify some of the stains that were on the pages. And yet when she went to the library and she saw the texts for the first time for herself, they had 4 edge paintings. Down the seam of where all the different pages meet one another, there were these fantastic depictions of country scenes that when you riffled through the pages, which start to fragment these paintings. And this wasn't captured at all within what at that time were the highest quality scans that were available. So this idea that Paul raised as well of what is important, what do we need to capture, I think is a very alive issue in terms of these ideas of materiality. And maybe the question, maybe it still should be about trying to capture everything, to not be selective, to make sure that we use what is essentially progressing towards infinite capacity, to try and capture as much as we can. In terms of tactility, how people interact with media, I think we need to be focusing on phenomenal report. So how are people actually using these things? What kind of language are they using in their descriptions? And this is something that I've focused on in reviews and in blogs and in kind of critical websites, saying what's it like to use these things. Often the longitudinal studies as to what it's phenomenally like to use these things aren't there. The Kindle's only 7 years old. It's only really been about for kind of 5 years as a mainstream concern. So when we're talking about e-reading, often the best phenomenological reports are captured in this public discourse about what it's actually like to use these things. So part of the historical record should, I think, be about capturing those experiences, what it's like to actually deploy these objects.
I think it's really encouraging that that's something that we're starting to not just think about text, for example, but how it's presented. So it's a really, really encouraging development. The second question that I had was something that Willard talked about and you touched on as well, I think, which is the ethical issues of this kind of research and what the humanities brings to particularly the big data research that Paul was mentioning, those kinds of things. And you talked about your students going into that data surveillance in their house. What do you both think that humanities can bring to those questions? I'm coming from the big data approach, where I don't think that scientists have thought very much about the ethical side of this, that you can use big data to find out things that people would be horrified that you were finding out. There was a fantastic example recently of apparently anonymised data about New York taxi cab journeys, that somebody did a very simple hack and found that you could retrace individual drivers' journeys very easily. And that should not be possible to do with that data. There are all sorts of ethical questions that are being thrown up. And you mentioned, what does it mean to be human with some of the advances in AI and so on. So I'm wondering if you could both talk a little bit about what humanities brings in terms of an ethical grounding for all of this activity.
If I may back up to the previous question just for a second, Jerry McGann's latest book, A New Republic of Letters, talks a great deal about the materiality of the book and why it is that we need to pay attention to books as they are found in the locations in which they are found. This is vividly obvious for 9th century manuscripts, for example, but this tendency's examples are all from the 19th century. And the second example of that is from biology. Evelyn Fox Keller, who is marvelous, says in one of her essays, how far can we take the metaphor of the genetic computer in an age when biological metaphors have so penetrated computer science that algorithms are written to mimic genetic operations. And biology, molecular biology, has advanced so far that you can program genes to do certain things. So these two very material operations are emerging, raising all kinds of interesting questions that simply don't occur at all if all you pay attention to is the abstract. About ethics, well, it all depends on what we mean by being human, whether our morality, our codes of behavior, our ethics, our ethical constraints are what they are. There is certainly a section of the population that maybe this shows my age more than it reveals anything else, of very young people whose way of rebellion against their parents is to expose all. There's a long article written, I think it was the New York Times, or maybe New York Review of Books, a study of young people, that is teenagers and slightly older, who deliberately use webcams and all sorts of other devices to do what their parents would be utterly horrified by. Whether there's any more to that than simply youthful rebellion, I don't know. I mean, I rebelled in somewhat differently. But it is playing with the idea of who we are as creatures. What are the boundaries? We're negotiating these boundaries from the time we're born, or perhaps before, up until, I hope, late adulthood. There are more practical questions, of course, of the Edward Snowden kind, of what sort of world we live in that we must censor material or not, how we treat each other, how we treat each other's secrets, and how we treat each other's private spaces. These are all up for grabs. And that's what's so interesting to someone whose data is not being inspected, and so frightening for people that are. We really have this whole business to think about once again, to renegotiate. I'm very old-fashioned when it comes to these things, but you can see the world changing in this respect, and it is intensely interesting.
I think in terms of what the humanities bring is what the humanities always brought. This is about historicising, recognising that lack of newness, the Willards, that these are concerns which do come from someone and which are embedded in us because they have come from someone. And what the humanities is really good at, I think, is querying fixity, questioning how things endure over time, focusing on context and social concerns that often get lost from pragmatic discussions. But I think, and also social concerns, this is what the humanities have always raised. What impact is this going to have? Why? Not just that continuous push forward for the sake of, but I think that the humanities shouldn't be seen as being purely a conservative force on science, of just taming its worst excesses. I think that would be an awful waste of the humanities. And that we can also take part in those speculative concerns as well, of looking where things can go. And again, our historicising, our querying fixity, that's part of speculative looking forward as well. There can be provocations that come out of that as much as there can be more conservative.